Hello and welcome to the Chromatic Podcast, where I bring you a fresh coat of innovation, ideas, and insights from top experts in business, arts, and culture. I'm your host, Craig Bundren of Bundren Painting, and the creator of the Bundren Building Arts Foundation. Today's colorful guest is David Coles, and it doesn't get any more colorful than this. David has written a book called Chromatopia. It's an illustrated history of color from a man that has spent his life entrenched in color and history. David is an amazing person to talk to. You can tell that this book is a work of passion, and it's something that the reader gets passionate about as they read it, or at least I did. I'm looking so forward to this interview. We have David Coles here with us, the author of a book called Chromatopia. That is, it's one of those books that you don't know that you don't have it. It's one of those that you start reading it and you're like, where has this been? The detail level in it, it's really interesting. For me, I have a commercial painting business, and this is going to go out in the lobby of the painting business so people can go through this because it is so interesting. It's a great history, not only a history of civilization, but it goes through the way all colors were formulated. It is beyond amazing. David, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. There's so many things that I want to start off with, and I apologize. I get very excited and try to do them all at one time. So I'll start with hello and thank you for being here.
Hi, Craig. Thanks so much for having me. I truly appreciate your very kind and enthusiastic words there.
Starting off, what made you decide to write a book about color?
I've literally spent my whole life working with color. I grew up in a family. My father was a commercial freelance illustrator, and my parents, or really my mother, owned an art shop. I'd also grown up in a family with my grandfather was a old school kind of sign writer who had then got himself a hardware store back in Wales, and where you would walk in, there'd be these giant sort of barrels of pure pigment when painters and decorators used to literally still make their own paints from scratch. And it just carried on throughout my whole life. I went to art school because I had some facility as an artist. I thought, in fact, I was going to become an artist. And whilst I was at the art school, which was Bristol Art School in the early 80s, we were being taught in a very kind of quite rigorous method. We were being taught about how to make our own materials as well. And it opened up a completely new world for me. And suddenly I actually became more interested in the materials and the actual use of the materials. The fact sort of then we can talk about then there's a whole history within that, which I can explain sort of on and off as we go. But in regards to the actual book, the book came about, the commissioning for the book came about because I had spent so many years making artist materials, but most of the materials I'm interested in for artists to use are what we call modern synthetic colors, using modern synthetic colors. So things with these are pigments that have these weird names, which I do talk about in the book. Colors like the phthalocyanines and the aralides and the diketopyrrols. Problem is that they've actually got fairly boring stories to tell. They're literally made in a laboratory, as it were, so there's not really anything exciting or rich or poetic about it. I really wanted to celebrate these pigments, the history of colour, because the fact is that it was so hard won. Up until the mid-19th century, or really actually probably the early 19th century, colour was extremely difficult to process, to draw out from nature, or to create colours from where they didn't exist in nature. And so I put an exhibition together, which I self-financed, and I did it purely as a passion piece. It's as simple as that. I wanted to have people come and sort of see how colours were created, and some of them still are created. And we had 400 exhibits. And this is a private gallery space that I hired who were friends of mine. And we were getting 300 people through a day. We were getting numbers that a major art institution would kill for. And it was just a small private gallery that I had basically taken over and put together this show. It was quite and then, believe me, I did not expect that response. I mean, I knew there was a sort of a thirst for information, for knowledge. And I think very much what you said in your introduction, people didn't realize that they were missing this information because they didn't know the information was missing in the first place. So once it was presented in front of them, people then started going, oh, that color does come from something. And obviously the book was an extension of that. Thames and Hudson commissioned me after coming to see the exhibition and realizing there was definitely an audience. And the feedback I've had ever since it was released has been from people is that they're looking at the world in a different way. They're looking at colors around them that they probably before this had been quite invisible to them.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I was talking to someone else about murals and how murals are in a background and people see them, but they don't realize many, many times that there's a mural there, or they just notice it, but they don't go to an in-depth of what it means, how it got there. Once you go through reading your book, I think so many people take colors for granted. Blue has always been there. Violet has always been there. As we grew up as kids, colors were always available. If you wanted colors, there's a box of crayons. Everything's available, and people didn't or don't take the time to go through and find out about how this color came into existence, how we mimicked natural colors through nature. Was it a hard? Obviously, you're passionate about it, and you have this show, and I think the authenticity of it is what brings people into something like that. They're like, wow, this is real. Your passion comes out in the book. I have not read the entire book, but what I have read has grabbed me. I cannot wait to sit down and finish this out. It's really good. So was it a hard book to write with the amount of research that you have to do on this? Because it's a lot of research. There's a lot involved, so many different things in putting these colors together.
So when Thames and Hudson did approach me, I certainly didn't scare me. And I think I did do a lot of research. Just, if nothing else, when you're talking, sometimes you can make mistakes. Sometimes you get your figures wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Once it goes into print, and in particular because I knew this book would be peer reviewed by people, who have extraordinary knowledge in often very specific areas. This, of course, in a sense, the Chromatopia book is a primer across all colors. It's an entry point for people to understand where colors come from and how they're made and why they were created in the first place. But I've got people out there who really know their stuff on very specifics, in particular conservators, scientists, conservators who are literally reconstructing many of these pigments themselves because it's specific to a painting they've got in the collection, say at the National Gallery or the Smithsonian. So I really had to obviously make sure that I was getting my information correct. The hardest part was when we'd made the decision on the format that we'd have one page of the photography and one page for most of the colors as a profile, a little individual thing, was trying to cut the information out. Wow, that was the difficult part. I could have run on, and like each of those profiles could have been 5 pages long. But so we had to bring them down to about, I think our average is around about 350 words per, which is difficult to concisely put it together. Yeah.
But it's perfect because it's on so many of them, it's got a hook. As you see this beautiful color, and then as in the explanation, there's a little hook about how it was made and the things that grab you. And I will throw a color out there like mummy brown. I mean, that's highly interesting. I mean, the fact that was actually a color derived from mummies.
Yeah. I mean, and in regards to mummy brown as an example, I mean, its use as an artist's pigment was relatively short-lived. I mean, it was, especially in the Western world, really only mostly through the 19th century. However, the use of mummy, or the importation of mummy into Europe, had gone on for hundreds of years because it was being used by apothecarists as a medicine. It was meant to dry out one of the humours. So the idea was that there was asphaltum in the the powder, the mummy powder, and that it would be useful for the human body to actually take it. So the mummies used to be ground down and would be taken, normally it's like a snuff, or put into some other material which could be ingested or as a poultice. And it was actually a medicine in that sense. You had medical applications, of course, completely, it's a quack so that there was ever actually of any use. But I mean, it was, so it had its uses for many years. And of course, also an age where the European colonial tourist would go on these trips and, from our perspective now, desecrate these graves purely so they could bring small mementos back to show off as curios in Victorian England.
It's almost as if something like that was fashionable at that time, and so then they brought it into the colors following fashion. This is the newest thing going on, and we'll see if we can do this in the architect of a color. Yeah.
Well, especially look in the 19th century, in the more sort of academic painters, we'd call them, the Royal Academicians, the UK in particular. Although you might have had, on one hand, very bright painters who worked with very bright colours. Say, obviously, the Impressionists over in France, but that leached through across all of Europe. But you also had the sort of brown gravy crew of artists who wanted everything to be very mellow and sat back. They were obviously looking towards the Dutch school of the 17th century. So colour like asphaltum, of mummy brown, which actually in oil creates a kind of a beautiful dark brown, transparent glaze, was perfect to sort of mix with colours to get these fabulous, transparent, receding shadows in the paintings. And of course, a lot of people didn't realise it. I mean, sometimes, and it's no different now, manufacturers will often apply names to colours that have no bearing on the actual colour itself. I'm trying to think of something. Maybe mummy is a good example. I mean, there's a couple of companies still out there that actually sell what they call mummy brown. It's not obviously made from ground up mummies anymore,
right?
Thankfully, but it's a kind of a hue. They're sort of, it's a replica of that colour, and because they're using it for marketing purposes. And I think even in the 19th century, a lot of people didn't truly realise that they were actually working with a colour made up from ground up mummies. And in fact, the story is one of the pre-Raphaelites, and I have a feeling it was Holman Hunt, when it was explained to him that the colour he was using, the mummy brown he was using, was made from this very material. Himself and his family had a very solemn burial of the tube of paint in their back garden to lay it to rest.
That is interesting. Scared of maybe the curse or something.
Maybe I think they were. I think they supposedly, because they felt it was wrong. I think they felt it was wrong. Although, of course, certainly to alleviate any opportunity of the mummy's curse. Yes, exactly.
The one of the things that you just spoke about at the National Gallery and restoring paintings, this is another thing you just made me think. So do they actually go back and, according to the year that it was made, they believe that it was these recipes of colors that were used in that painting, and then recreate those to touch those up? Or is it a more modern type of application?
Yeah. Generally, conservators, if they are going to, shall we say, retouch an artwork where parts of the painting have actually fallen away or need to be replaced, to be infilled, they'll probably generally nowadays use a modern pigment to replicate the colour. The reason that the conservators will often go into the investigation of how a pigment or a colour has been constructed, because they want to understand why it's behaving the way it is now. Especially a lot of the historical colours weren't enormously stable, and they have discoloured with age or faded with age, or they may have a detrimental effect upon the paint film with the oil. If it's an oil painting, with the way that it actually reacts with the oil over a century, 3 centuries, or even, in the case of a couple of pigments I can think of, in a decade. So they want to understand why it's happening, because obviously they'd like to be able to stop it from continuing, and they also want to understand maybe what the colour was prior. There are many paintings I could go into a gallery, National Gallery London, probably a good example, where we now view art through the lens of history, the way that the colours have altered or the paintings have altered with age. And we're not seeing them how the artist had intended, so that what now look like very mellow paintings, lots of beautiful browns for the leaves, when they were painted, would have actually been quite bright greens. And I think the biggest, probably most public example of this would have been after the cleaning of the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I grew up with, with books on the Sistine Chapel of Michelangelo's paintings, and everything was, in a sense, had that kind of slight historic tone to it, and it looked like it sat from something from the 16th, 17th, 16th century. Mm-hmm. And when it was cleaned, after removing all of the smoke from the candles from centuries, suddenly you see that Michelangelo is using hot pinks and sharp, minty greens, and like they celebrated color, and they weren't against using quite poppy colors.
I think that's another thing that we take for granted. As I've gone through a lot of the museums in Europe, and I see these classic paintings, and I think that, wow, they've held up really, really well. And I guess that actually, in all actuality, they've faded out, maybe some of the magnificence of the colors being so old. But it's amazing to me what good condition that they're still in, and at that time that they could make these paints and they could bind to where they would last this long.
Sure. I think one of the things that many artists, and believe me, artists don't make much money, and when they have to buy their art materials, it can be, quite an investment. However, still, at this moment in time, art materials have never been cheaper for the artist. The cost of raw materials for an artist in the 15th or 14th century would have been astronomical, to the point where generally the more expensive colors, such as lapis lazuli, genuine ultramarine from lapis lazuli, would have only been purchased generally because the patron for the painting, the person who actually commissioned the painting, put up the money. An artist off their own probably wouldn't have been able to. Plus, artists had to make their paints from scratch. Many an artist would literally be taking rocks and, with a mortar and pestle, grinding them down into a fine powder, then potentially washing them. And then that's before they start then grinding it, milling it into a binder. Normally it would be oil, to make their own paint. So with all that investment of time and effort and their own knowledge, they weren't going to waste anything. And they learned how to construct paintings in a very stable manner, where sometimes the sort of natural, the fact that it's the abundance now of materials means that we often use our painting materials a little bit with too much abandon, and that can often be to the detriment of the long-term stability of the painting. But I would never tell an artist, no, you can't do that. And I do get asked many times, can I do this? And it's a case of, oh, of course you can do it. You can do anything you want to. That's always actually setting up the next question, which they have to ask, which is, what happens if I do that? So an artist might ask, can I mix oil paint with water? Well, you can do that, but it's going to absolutely destroy your paint.
Yes.
So I can only advise them in regards to the potential downsides of some of their practice, but I would never want an artist to keep pushing the envelope in that sense. And many a great work of art, in particular, I think of, say, the New York School post-war artists like Morris Louis, Alcantara. They were literally, really pushing the nature of paint to its very edge, almost breaking the paint to be able to get these effects that they were after.
That's really, really interesting. As it makes me think of so many things, from the fact that you see pictures of royalty that are humongous, but when an artist painted his neighbor, which was equally as beautiful of a picture, it was on a very small canvas. So it's almost like the classes where the size of the painting.
No question that it wasn't. It certainly hasn't been understood recently, but through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, artists were part of the Guild of St. Luke, and St. Luke is the patron saint of artists, and he's the patron saint because he supposedly painted the Virgin Mary. And in fact, there are many small little paintings you can find of St. Luke painting, sitting there with his little easel painting the Virgin Mary. So the Guild of St. Luke was basically a union for artists, for painters. And it had very strict rules. To be able to get into a guild, you had to do a piece that was your masterwork. And so with this, it would be like a kind of like an exam. You were actually showing it to the head of the guild for him to say, you're a good enough artist, you can join the union, you can join the guild. And so, as I said, this piece was called a master, and it became a masterpiece. So the masterpiece that we use now in regard to a great work of art actually originally meant the work that you offered to enter into the Guild of St. Luke in the Middle Ages. So with that in mind, artists had to work within quite strict rules that the guilds set up. You weren't allowed to use cheaper materials if you could help it. You certainly weren't allowed to cheat your patron, but by the same token, the patron wasn't allowed to skimp too much on the material. So there was quite strict rules in this relationship between the painter and the actual commissioning agents, the patrons, whether that be the church or rich individuals.
You would almost have to prove yourself worthy of the paint.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, believe me, there weren't many artists. There weren't many artists that could afford the expensive colours. Dürer was very lucky because he lived in Saxony, with large amount deposits of certain natural forming colours, and he had ready access to them. The vast majority of the bright colours came in from the East, came in via Venice. And then from there, they were distributed throughout the rest of Europe. But of course, every time it's going through another set of hands, the price rises because everyone's taking their cut. So that an artist in northern France or in Britain would have been paying a lot more than an artist who was in Venice, which is why you have some of the great work coming out of the 15th, 16th century from artists like Titian and Tintoretto, because they had ready access, because they were that close to Venice, so they actually could get hold of these colors at a much more reasonable price.
It makes me think of the spice traders, and maybe there were paints were on those ships as they were to and from with the spices.
Yeah, the spice routes and the color routes were actually often in complete tandem, and so you had the silk trade, silk routes across Central Asia, and then you had the spice routes that came normally up from what's now modern Indonesia and India, and often they would be filling the galleons with other materials of value as well, which of course included some colors.
This is amazing. I'm loving this. I feel like I'm learning so much as we go. This is great.
It's world within worlds.
It is. There's so many levels to it. It's one of those, you don't realize how much you don't know until someone starts speaking about this, and the interest level just shoots through the roof. I wanted to ask you. I'll start out. I wanted to talk about some of the colors, because there's some in there that just stand out. So what is your favorite color, and why? Is it because the actual color, or is it the process of a color?
So I still have it's a real thing for me. I still love rose madder more than any other color from the book, to be honest with you. And I think the reason is that, having also, as I did with many of these colors, I literally had to create them myself. Because I wanted to learn the process. I wanted to work out how difficult or easy it was to literally be able to, for us to create the color. And more importantly, how historically difficult it was to create the color. And rose madder comes from a dye that comes from inside of the roots of the madder plant. And this madder plant, which there are many madder plants around the world, but this one in particular comes from Central Asia, really comes from around Iran and Turkey. And it's very, the plant has to have been grown for a minimum of 3 years. As it grows, of course, the roots get thicker, and it actually develops the alizarin and the purpurin dyes inside the roots. These are dug up, and then we extract, we draw out the color, and then that's now a dye. And from there, we actually precipitate it with with chemicals, normally weak alkalis, and we create what's called a lake pigment, which a lake pigment is, in a true sense, is basically a dye that's been stuck onto, if you like, to a inert, transparent pigment, and so you end up with a pigment rather than a dye. I should maybe quickly mention the difference between a dye and a pigment. A dye has no physicality. Its action is to stain. It actually attaches itself to cloths. Obviously, all of our clothing is dyed. Okay, we use dyes for that.
Right.
A pigment is an indivisible little grain of color, and in itself needs something to bind it or glue it onto a surface. And so that's why pigments are generally mixed with, say, linseed oil to make an oil paint, or gum arabic to make a watercolor, or an acrylic material, acrylic medium to make an acrylic paint. And that's obviously, we're making a paint there. Pigments have great durability. Most pigments, especially now in the modern age, are highly resistant to sunlight, so they don't fade and don't react. Dyes, by their very nature, because they have no sort of substance, in the same way there's no physical grain of color, get acted upon by light very, very rapidly. And that's why, of course, our clothes fade, partly by sunlight and partly by the action of soaps, again, which are weak alkalis, which slowly weaken the structure of those dyes. The reason I mentioned that is because it was a chemistry that had to be developed by, of course, a lot of this chemistry was developed by in the Arabian Peninsula in the sort of 7th to 11th century. Very clever chemistry in an age where there was no understanding of chemistry as we understand it now. And madder, the color that's drawn out, then has to be made into a pigment, as I mentioned, and then it has to be precipitated, then it has to be dried and has to be washed again. And it's a beautiful, gentle, it's virtually the only natural pink color of any brightness that's ever been made available to humankind. The process is so sweet because it comes from roots. It's something so mundane. Mm-hmm. It's not, everyone goes on, and of course I love it, everyone goes on about lapis lazuli, but that's because it's quite extraordinary to see literally rocks of this deep, beautiful royal blue. And in a way, you can't get past that. But what I love is the process from some very unprepossessing starting point to something quite magnificent in this beautiful pink color. And also because that's me talking about making it into a pigment, but madder itself as a dye has been used for millennia. I mean, it is a very important color. Especially in the Indian subcontinent, they've been using it for dyeing their textiles reds and crimsons for century upon century.
Do you see color or do you see recipes? Because it's almost like another question would be, are you armchair chemist or mad scientist? Because these recipes that I've seen that you've put in the book, or yes, the descriptions of what it takes to make these colors, there's some really complex things that happen with, I believe, vapors and exposing things to other items, and very interesting things coming from cuttlefish, or I'm not even sure what a predatory snail is, but obviously there's one in there that makes a color.
There, yeah. One of the great things is that humans obviously have, almost probably from the very beginnings of our sort of existence, seem to have been drawn as a desire to, one, make a statement, make a mark to say, I was here. So we need something to do that. And obviously in the very earliest beginnings, it would have been just ochres dug up out of the ground, or charcoals from the fire. But there's been this ongoing desire to surround ourselves with beauty, and that's driven this desire to find ways of either discovering colour from nature or creating extra colours from nature. Many of the colours that have been created, I know, were almost certainly serendipitous. They're by accident, are often observation of nature, and then, in a sense, mimicking nature, and then, if one likes, sort of taking it further, sort of refining it again. So that you mentioned about the vapors. We're talking here about, say, lead making flake white, whereby we take heavy, dull, grey lead, and we can actually expose it to the vapors of vinegar and hot, fresh manure and tanning bark, and it literally reacts with the lead and creates a white rust. It would have happened that the ancient Greeks, who were the first to sort of really mention that we can find the use of lead white, they would have seen a kind of rust naturally forming on lead. And if you put a piece of lead, if you have a piece of lead, obviously it's not so sort of available nowadays, but if you have a piece of lead and you left it outside, you will see a white rust start to appear on it, but just naturally, because it's atmospheric pollutants and moisture will actually start reacting with metals. Most metals obviously have some kind of reactivity. One classic metal, of course, doesn't, is gold. And it was its very lack of tarnishing that led it to be used because of its sort of, almost eternal quality as a color.
If you move to a more modern type, and I forgot which color, and it might be the lead white that you said has a titanium in it. Is it the lead white that I know that?
Titanium white itself is a color, is a bright white that, of course, is basically the white that you see in everything. Any paint that's white now will be titanium white. But the ore body it comes from is ilmenite, and the ilmenite is a deep black color. So from this very black mineral, we actually extract one of the whitest whites. But it's through a very complex process of extraction, reaction, etc. Because ilmenite is an ore built from many elements, and titanium is one of the elements within that actual ore. So it's a case of understanding how to draw these elements out of these mixed materials.
Does that have anything to do with the modern paint that's made out of titanium oxide, TiO2?
Yeah. So, I mean, here in Australia, actually, we have some of the biggest deposits of titanium. The titanium in this country is out in WA, and it's actually out there as a sand. It's not a black mineral. That wasn't obviously as exciting as having a black mineral. The ilmenite ore that I found, I had to procure from one of those kind of geologists sort of sites where people have got exhibition quality pieces. But most of it comes as a grey sand, which they can then basically extract, separate out the titanium from the other. Normally there's iron in there as well. So they're separating the iron from the titanium. So we get this bright white. And it was a long process. And it took about 40 years of hard sort of research and development by the Swiss and then the Americans in the late 19th century, early 20th century, to actually sort of get it right. And it was important. The reason why so much effort was put into finding a way of creating titanium white was because up until that point, the only other white that everyone was using was flake white, lead white. And people were dying because, of course, it poisons you. It's not probably so much the users of lead paints that have a problem. The biggest problem was the makers of the lead white pigment. You imagine a factory where, thousands of tons were being made, or hundreds of tons were being made over a year. The dust in the atmosphere would have been horrific. And the biggest issue with lead is that once it enters your system, it never leaves your system. It attaches itself to the bone, and it's very difficult to actually get lead back out of your system. And when it does, when you get lead poisoning, it's pretty bad. I mean, you will die from it. But I mean, that's extreme. And those days have virtually gone now, thankfully. So,
thankfully, definitely.
Thankfully, yeah. Exactly. No one needs to die for their art. Let's say that. Yeah?
So you have a small section of the book about synthetics, and I guess that would be more of the modern type. When you talk about synthetics, is this synthetics as it refers to an artist type paint, or is this mass market house painting? Is it all types of paint, or is it just for the artist type?
No, it's for all. I mean, in fact, that's a good point. That what you have to understand is that both through history and certainly in recent history, all pigment development and pigment manufacture is driven by big industries that have a lot of money because there's wide usage. So in regards to just the manufacture of paints, it's house paints, obviously, which are the biggest driver for the use of the production of, say, titanium white, and basically really for virtually all colors. Also in regards to research and development, which many pigment manufacturers will spend 20 years developing a new pigment. They're driven by an application where there's a lot of money, such as auto coatings, cosmetics, plastics, maybe even food packaging. So these are areas where there's massive industries. As artists, what we do, or as art material manufacturers, and then we pass this obviously on to the artist, what we do is ride on the back of all that research and development. When these pigments first become available, they can often be extremely expensive because the manufacturer who developed them has to in some way draw back some of the investment they put into it. And they'll have a patent on it, and they will be the only people manufacturing it. A good example would be Pyrrole Red. Pyrrole Red was created from scratch by Ciba Geigy. It's a sort of a new generation modern synthetic pigment that was developed by Ciba Geigy for Ferrari. It was created as Ferrari Red for their cars from the year 2000 onwards. And you can see that there's an area where there's enough money flowing around that they're prepared to put all that research into it. We had to wait around about 10 years for the price to come down once the patent finally lapsed. And now, of course, we can use Pyrrole Red for artist use. Mm-hmm. When I talk about synthetics, maybe I should explain to everyone that when I use the word synthetic, what we're talking about here are modern colors that are created by rearranging carbon chains and oxygen molecules and then adding other elements to this to create new compounds that create new colors. This started in the late 19th century. The Germans started with what we call the Hansa colors, the yellows, also known as aralides. I call them aralides. They're all the same. Hansa is actually a proprietary name from BASF. But basically, these colors have extraordinary clarity of color. They're very potent, very, very, small amounts can be used to actually color a large amount of material. And they are generally extremely light, fast, and non-reactive. So in a sense, this is, of course, what drives the future development of pigments is reduced toxicity, higher performance, hopefully cheaper. One can always hope for that. And the other thing is a lot of the older colors, which are derived, what we call the inorganic pigments, are derived from materials that have been dug up out of the ground. Something like an ochre is obviously pretty basic. All we're doing is digging up the ochre. We may wash it and grind it down, but we're not really doing anything more to it. A color like cadmium, we're actually digging up the actual cadmium ore and then reacting it. The problem is that there's a finite amount of these materials in the ground. Maybe not the iron. Iron is everywhere. I mean, I'm living in a country which is basically sitting on top of just vast quantities of iron. That's why you see the red deserts here. But there are other materials that are running out, or they're very scarce. Cobalt is a really good example, and obviously with its scarcity, money can be made, and that's unfortunately one of the compounding issues in regards to the civil war in the Congo. There is a civil war, and a lot of it is about resources, and one of those resources is cobalt. It's not cobalt being used for artist materials, however. It's cobalt being used in lithium batteries.
The market moves everything.
Yeah. So the history of colors is allied and intricately involved with the history of politics and power and economies. Wars have been fought over color.
And that's what's so interesting going into the book, that it's so many levels deep that you don't realize the history of these things until you start going through it, and it is just amazingly interesting. It's one of those that's, I don't know that I'm interested until I start reading it. It's if you've held people down and showed them one page, then they would take the rest of the book. It's that interesting.
I think for yourself, certainly for myself, if I read one more book about color, well, actually, that's a lie. I was going to say I'd go mad. I wouldn't at all. I mean, I'll always love books about color. But in a sense, the worst part for me now is trying to find something that I haven't heard about or read about before. And I don't want that to sound, that I know everything. I don't. But there's a lot of the same material gets sort of worked over by, I often see the same sort of stories coming out. So finding a subject matter which is different. I've recently been very interested in perfume and how the history of perfume and how, again, where perfume, the raw materials of perfumes come from. And because it's not color, maybe in a sense I'm coming at it with, I was going to say fresh eyes, but obviously in this case a fresh nose, and just sort of something to learn that's outside of my normal, my world that I invest myself in.
I don't know. That's such an interesting thing as well, because everything that you're bringing up is a recipe. You have to take these certain things and do them in certain ways in an order and put it together. And then all of a sudden it's something that smells beautiful, or it's something that looks beautiful. There's so much to that. I very much see the similarity as you start describing that.
One of the reasons why I put 4 recipes in there, partly, if nothing else, was one, so that I don't expect people to make their colors from them. But what I wanted to show was in a little bit more depth, the process that it does take, and the materials, the quite exotic materials often used to actually create the pigment. The pigment itself is exotic, but actually often there'll be other materials needed to help refine it, to wash it, to clean it, to react it. And there is as exotic as the actual original, material we're working with. So lapis lazuli, you're using waxes and resins to help separate out impurities from the blue lazurite. I find those kind of almost like hidden heroes as exciting as the actual final product. Do you know what I mean? Like these little resins that come from a small island off Greece, or a balsam that comes from a tree in Indonesia. But no one ever talks about them. But I sort of feel like they've been, as I said, sort of hidden, and they should be celebrated as well.
Now you have an art background, and you have an art education.
Mm.
Are you a painter? Are you an artist?
Let me put it this way. I think once an artist, always an artist. You don't retire from being an artist. I have obviously really do not get in the studio very much. I was able to do a painting for an exhibition early this year, just before lockdown. And that was the first time I'd been in the studio for about 2 years. So I don't get a chance now. Of course, in my mind, I'm still an artist. And to be honest with you, my business, apart from obviously having written Chromatopia, also, and this is really, I suppose, the background that gives me the knowledge base to have put this together, is I run a paint making company. We have a company, Langridge, that makes one of the world's greatest oil paints. I think I certainly hope to try and make it that way. And from that, that takes up a lot of my time. But the thing is, actually, in a sense, the whole business for me is a giant creative process. I mean, I am a little bit of a control freak. I determine absolutely every element of that product. I design the labels, I choose the packaging, I decide what colors we're going to make and offer, I decide on the materials, the mediums, the solvents, the varnishes that we make. So every aspect, in a sense, is part of one great act of creation in that sense.
I'm very glad that you mentioned the fact that you make paint, because I definitely had some questions about that. And it's almost like you're the artist that makes art possible for other artists if you're making the paint. It's so the paint that you make, is it does it rhyme with these recipes, or is it a synthetic more? Is it a handmade? Describe that a little bit too.
Okay, yeah, sure. So when I emigrated to Australia in 1992, and literally within 3 months I'd set up the company. But when I started, I had virtually no money. So I started, my offerings were mostly things like mediums, artist oil mediums. And I should mention that Langridge, we're a specific an oil paint company. We make artist oil paints and mediums and varnishes to go alongside that. But what I did do was offer pigments from the very beginning, because in a sense, all I was doing was sourcing these dry pigments from around the world and then literally repacking them to make it, convenient for an artist. No artist probably really wants to buy 25 kilos of pigment. They probably only need about 100 to 500 grams. So I started there. But when we decided to make the paint, and it took me many years developing it, I had a conundrum, which was there are certainly many great paints already in the market that have been there long before me. And I didn't want to replicate or just follow what had already been done. I also realized that Australia has this strange dichotomy. It's, in a sense, one of the oldest nations in the world. Certainly, it's obviously got the oldest continuous civilization in the world, going at least 60,000 years uninterrupted with the first peoples of Australia. But of course, on the other side of that is we have the modern Australia, the Western Australia, and that brightness and newness of the modern Australia appealed to me because it's not burdened too much by history, certainly not like being in Europe. And for me, coming from Europe, that was quite fun, it was very sort of freeing. So I wanted to celebrate the I suppose, in a sense, the modernity of the country I was in. And so I created a paint range using modern pigments, mostly these synthetic pigments. One of the reasons also for that is because those colors, as I mentioned earlier, are extremely intense and bright. And again, I'm sure many of your listeners will have seen photography or films or TV of Australia. And, generally the sun is always shining. These extraordinary, enormous blue skies. And it certainly for most of the year, it is like that. We're actually here in Melbourne at the moment. It's the middle of winter. I can see through the skylight. It's actually a beautiful, bright, clear morning. A little bit chilly, but we get enormous amounts of sunlight here. And that sunlight is very direct because it's not, especially in the summer, it's not filtered through a haze of moisture. It's very dry. So the sunlight is very direct, and when it strikes materials, when it strikes objects, they shine, they vibrate in a completely different way to, say, a North European or North American kind of light, which is a much cooler light. And that means that all the colors are vibrating in a different way. I think that Australians probably unknowingly have a slightly different sensibility to color to someone from, say, Germany, because we're surrounded by colors that seem to be far more intense as a general rule. Sometimes it can be almost to the point of bleaching out, that sunlight can be so, so harsh. But I wanted then to create colors that in a sense was in balance with that idea of a heightened color sensibility. So colors I'm creating or selecting, the vast majority of the colors that I offer, the pigments, they're what are called single pigment. In other words, there's only one pigment in there. It's not a mixture of two pigments, but the colors I do make as mixtures have a very specific function, and normally it's to replicate something that's kind of quite high in vibrancy in the color. I want something that's sort of like intense, almost like plastic colors in a sense.
When you put these together, are these like handmade colors and special runs? We're making this color for X amount of time, or is it a continuous
That's a very
thing?
interesting point. Okay, so to be honest with you, we've been on the most extraordinary growth spurt for the last 2 years as people have got to know the paint, and because we're all like this, but I think artists even more so, very cautious about trying a new material, trying a new paint, mainly because of the expense, as I said before. You're putting a lot of money into something you may have never tried. So people are trying it, and once they've tried it, they realize that what they're working with, they really enjoy. So our sales have increased. So we've been very much keeping on top of that. But you mentioned about special runs. Two things. We do make colors, custom colors for artists. Artists will approach us and say, this is the color I need. I need a very specific color. And we can make it. Now, obviously, we can't make just a 140 ml tube for that person. Generally, the minimum run would be an 8-liter quantity. But for many artists, that's fine. And we actually make a custom color for them to their specification. The other thing, and I must admit that it has been on my mind for the last year or so, is I would like in the future to actually start bringing out, I suppose, limited edition colors that we run we make it once, and we're not going to make it. If we do make it, we'll make it in 2 years' time. So, and it's not because I'm trying to create a false sort of anxiety. I don't want people to be like, oh my God, I have to buy it, otherwise I won't get it. It's more of a kind of it gives me an opportunity to enjoy working with some colours that I've made a personal decision not to have in our main line. And those, of course, in particular, are historical colours. Historic colours, although I celebrate them in the book, they have their place in history, mainly because they've been superseded by modern pigments that have better specification. They're more durable. They're easier to keep as a paint. I mean, there's some pigments I would definitely love to make up into paints, and I'm sure I will. It will take a bit of time to get the formulation right, but I have, a small laboratory where I can hone. And it's a little bit like a chef creating a new recipe. You kind of know the vague boundaries of what you're working with. You know that this cinnamon and this cardamom and this whatever you want to talk about in baking, what it will generally do, but in proportions, how that will affect the final result. It's the same thing for me when making a paint. It is quite sort of creative in that sense, making a paint from scratch, because you have to work out what's the optimum. It's not often what you originally thought as well.
And these have lifespans of decades, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the starting point, is that whatever. Do you know what? Making cheap paints, it's easy. I mean, there's a reason when we talk about cheap paints, student paints basically have very, very small amounts of the actual coloring matter, the pigment in them. That means the vast majority of a student paint is really, if we're talking about a student oil paint, is mostly the oil, or a student acrylic paint is mostly just the acrylic medium. And it's very easy to make paints that way because there's very little sort of mixing. There's very little actions to actually separate the pigments out. That's the main part of paint making. As we keep raising the pigment loading, that becomes more and more difficult, and that's where all the investment in time and expertise and skill comes in. So that if I'm going to make a paint, it's going to be to its optimum performance, because otherwise, why would I bother doing it? I don't want to make something that's, to be honest with you, crap. And that will take a bit of time, for sure.
Well, this has been amazing. I feel like I've had a history lesson, and your description of colors and the way that they vibrate, and it makes me, as you speak about it, I want to be there. I want to jump on a plane and be in Australia.
I would love you to come over. I really would. Obviously, maybe we might have to wait a few months, but hopefully with any luck that will happen. I mean, I come, as a general rule, my wife Louise and I, we come over to North America at least once a year. It would be great to meet people again, meet people for the first time face to face. I don't know how many Zoom or FaceTime or Skype meetings you've done. I've met a lot more people virtually than I have actually in real life in the last year. Yeah.
Well, if we can ever get you to Houston, myself and the art community, I'm sure would just love to sit down and have a conversation with you. Your book is Chromatopia, and it's available in the United States through
Thames and Hudson.
Okay. And then also, go ahead.
I was going to say, sorry, the publisher is Thames and Hudson, and should be available through any of your normal book resellers, whether in store or online. I know that it's certainly still in print at this moment.
And if anybody wants to follow you or contact you, we will definitely put that in the notes of the show. But if you want to put a website out there or anything, you're more than welcome to do that.
We've just actually renamed the website. So we did have chromatopia.org, but I think we're going to move to chromatopia.org.au, because we're actually setting up an actual Chromatopia museum now as well, back here in Melbourne.
Once again, David, I really appreciate your time. You are as interesting as the book, if not more. I could talk to you for hours on this. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I truly loved today. I thought it was fantastic, and I hope we can do this again soon. Yeah, for sure.
Good deal. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Chromatic Podcast. You can learn more about what we're up to by visiting Bundren.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and rate and review it. Join us next week for more insights on business, arts, and culture.